Let's start with the money. Tier 1, the nano or urban craft distillery. You are renting an industrial space in a mid-sized city. You have a small still, a tasting room, and ambitions to eventually make a whiskey that people drive 40 minutes for. Total startup investment, $500,000 to $2.5 million. Equipment runs $200,000 to $400,000. Facility build out on a lease, $150,000 to $300,000. Federal and state licensing fees, $20,000 to $35,000. Initial inventory and working capital, $200,000 to $1 million, depending on your runway assumptions. At this scale, you are surviving on unaged spirits, gin, vodka, white dog, while you wait for the whiskey. You will wait approximately 3 years before your bourbon is legally straight under federal standards and commercially attractive to a retailer or a bar. Tier 2, a proper craft whiskey operation, $5 to $15 million. You have real production capacity, bonded warehouse space you actually own or control, a grain silo, and enough working capital that the aged whiskey can be your primary revenue stream rather than a side project. This is the level where the economics of patience begin to make sense, assuming the market cooperates. Tier 3, mid-scale regional production distillery, $25 to $75 million. You have multiple stills, automated bottling, a distribution agreement signed before you opened, and enough capacity that your unit economics work at scale. This is the floor for a business that can be acquired by someone larger in 10 years at a number worth mentioning. Tier 4, what Staghorn, an Atlanta-based developer, decided to build in Garrard County, Kentucky in 2023. They called it the largest independently owned bourbon distillery in the state of Kentucky. Reported investment, approximately $250 million, 210 acres. Production started January 2024. We will return to Garrard County in approximately 7 minutes, and you will not enjoy what happened. For a market reference on what a going concern distillery actually trades for when someone wants one, in June 2024, the Lakes Distillery in Cumbria, England, an established, producing craft distillery with brand equity and aging inventory already in place, was acquired by Naya Timber, the English sparkling wine producer, for 71 million British pounds, approximately 89 million US dollars. That is your benchmark for what a real operational distillery with a real brand behind it looks like on the open market. You are not buying copper and oak. You are buying a decade of sunk costs someone else already paid. Now the process, because the money is the easy part. In the United States, you are navigating 2 simultaneous licensing tracks that do not coordinate with each other, do not share information, and do not care about your opening date. First, the federal track. The Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB, requires a distilled spirits plant permit before you can produce a single drop. The application is filed through their permits online system. The federal application fee is $0. That is the single piece of good news in this section. The timeline is 6 months minimum, often longer. The TTB reviews your ownership structure, your facility floor plan, your security protocols, and your production methods. Before you apply, you need to know that any felony conviction under federal or state law within 5 years of application disqualifies you entirely. Any federal misdemeanor related to liquor within 3 years disqualifies you. The TTB may require an on-site inspection. Your label, every SKU you plan to sell, cannot be pre-approved until the facility permit is active, and label approval itself runs an average of 90 days per label. If you have 4 expressions at launch, budget 1 year of pre-sale label limbo. Second, the state track. Kentucky, where the serious bourbon producers operate, requires a separate Class A distiller's license from the state's Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control. Annual cost, $3,090. Sounds manageable until you add local zoning approvals, fire marshal sign-offs, health department clearances, and the fact that in parts of Kentucky you are still dealing with dry county ordinances that date to Prohibition and have not been renegotiated since your grandfather was born. Third, the bonded warehouse. Federal law requires all aging spirits to be stored in a registered bonded facility under TTB oversight. Your rick house, the building where the barrels sit for the next 4 years, must be registered separately from your production permit. That is a third concurrent process. Total elapsed time from first application to first bottle legally labeled and available for commercial sale, 3 to 5 years under a normal scenario. Industry consultants who specialize in distillery launches report that most new operators underestimate their pre-revenue cash burn by 30 to 50%. 18 to 36 months of operating expenses will be spent before significant revenue from aged spirit begins. At a craft scale, that alone is $400,000 to $1 million in cash deployed against zero return from the product you actually came here to make. So here's the question that people who have done this twice ask before they do it a third time. Why build when you can buy? Option 1 is the NDP model. NDP stands for non-distillery producer. You do not build anything. You go to a contract distiller, the most prominent being MGP Ingredients in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, a publicly traded company that supplies aged whiskey to a substantial number of the craft whiskey brands currently on your local bar's shelf, and you purchase finished or semi-aged spirit in bulk. You blend it, bottle it, put your label on it, and you skip the 3 to 5 year wait entirely. You do not need a distilled spirits plant permit. You need only a bottler's basic permit, a bottling line, and a marketing budget. The overhead calculus is completely different. This is not a secret the industry is hiding. It is simply not the story the brands are telling when they talk about their founder's vision. Option 2 is to buy distressed assets when the cycle turns. Right now, it is turned. In June 2026, the entire Garrard County Distilling campus, 210 acres of bourbon infrastructure in central Kentucky, a working bonded warehouse, production equipment, and thousands of barrels of aging bourbon sold at a court-ordered master commissioner auction for $20 million. The buyer was Tom Collins Distilling, an entity affiliated with Sazerac, the privately held company behind Buffalo Trace. The campus sold below its appraised value. The reported development investment had been approximately $250 million. Separately, in early 2025, Tennessee Distilling expressed interest in acquiring Waterford Whiskey, the Irish terroir whiskey brand founded by Mark Rainier, with established distribution and aging inventory, for approximately €6 million, $6.9 million, for an operational brand with barrels already in warehouse. The capital-efficient play in this market is not to break ground. It is to let someone else break ground, watch them run out of cash before the whiskey matures, and then show up at the auction. Both of the above scenarios happen within 14 months of each other. There will be more. Here is how the money actually works once the whiskey exists. Think of it this way. Every barrel you fill is a savings account that earns compound interest in both volume and value. But you cannot touch it for 4 years, and if you need cash before 4 years, you sell at a loss. A single 53-gallon barrel costs you approximately $1,200 to $2,000 all in to produce. That includes your grain bill. A typical bourbon mash is at least 51% corn plus rye and malted barley, your water processing, your labor, your yeast and fermentation time, and your new charred oak barrel, which runs around $400 on its own. Pour that into the rickhouse and walk away. 4 years later, you open it. The Angel's share, evaporation through the barrel staves, has taken 12 to 15% of the volume. You now have roughly 45 to 47 gallons of aged spirit. At standard 92 proof bottling, that fills approximately 240 750 milliliter bottles. At $25 per bottle retail, the entry price for a commercially credible shelf bourbon, that barrel generates $6,000 in gross retail revenue. After the standard distributor margin of 20 to 25% and a retailer markup of 30 to 40%, you net somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 per barrel on a $2,000 production cost. That is a 50 to 100% return spread across 4 years. roughly 12 to 25% annualized in a best-case scenario before overheads, staff, debt service, and the 3 years of gin sales that kept the lights on while you waited. Now scale that against an institution. Brown-Forman, the company behind Jack Daniel's Tennessee Whiskey and Woodford Reserve, reported a gross margin of 60.5% in fiscal year 2024. That is what happens when you age millions of barrels annually instead of hundreds, when your grain contracts are negotiated in the hundreds of millions of pounds per year, when your distribution network covers 57 countries, and your brand recognition was established before the people buying you were born. The mechanism is not complicated. You are buying time and selling it at a premium. The companies that have enough capital to survive until the time matures are making 60.5% gross margins. The ones who run out of capital before the time matures are in receivership. Let's meet Anthony Michael Scott. Scott was the founder of A.M. Scott Distillery in Troy, Ohio. Troy is not Bardstown. It is a mid-sized city in Miami County, an hour north of Dayton, and it is not a market anyone would describe as a natural hub for premium American whiskey. Scott's operation was regional and small. This is not a story about an 8-figure fraud. It is more instructive than that. On December 22, 2025, A.M. Scott Distillery filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing listed total assets of less than $500,000 against liabilities of approximately $3,350,000. That is roughly $6.7 owed for every dollar owned. Before the bankruptcy filing, in March 2025, a Mercer County grand jury had already indicted Scott on 2 fifth-degree felony charges, 1 count of theft by deception, and 1 count of passing bad checks. The alleged offense covered a roughly 2-week window between December 17th and December 30th, 2024. Scott had issued a check for $6,567.35, knowing it would be dishonored, and received business product of equivalent value through deception, $6,500, on a company carrying $3.5 million in debt. Scott ultimately entered guilty pleas to 2 misdemeanor counts of passing bad checks. The felony charges were dismissed. He was sentenced to 1 year of probation and ordered to pay $6,000 in restitution. Here is what that story tells you about the bottom of this industry. The fraud was not the cause of the distillery's failure. The fraud was a symptom of a business that was already functionally insolvent, a business where the only way to acquire $6,000 of operating supplies in the final 2 weeks of December was to write a check that would not clear. The company owed $3.5 million it did not have. The founder's criminal liability was for $6,000. Craft distilleries do not usually end in a single dramatic event. They end in a sequence of small decisions made by someone who has been watching their burn rate exceed their revenue for 18 months and has not yet found a way to stop it. The barrel costs are fixed. The rent is fixed. The labor is fixed. The whiskey is not ready. And at some point, the gap between what is in the warehouse and what is in the bank account becomes a gap that can only be bridged with a bad check. Scott is on probation. The distillery is in bankruptcy. Whatever is in those barrels is presumably still aging somewhere, waiting for a buyer who did not build it. Now let's go back to Garrard County. In 2023, Staghorn, an Atlanta-based real estate and development group, announced plans to build what would be marketed as the largest independently owned bourbon distillery in the state of Kentucky. The site, a 210-acre parcel in Garrard County, a rural county in central Kentucky, approximately 40 miles south of Lexington. The development investment was reported at approximately $250 million. The ambition was not unreasonable on paper. The American whiskey market had spent the previous decade in a documented growth phase. International demand was expanding. Kentucky had become a tourism destination in its own right. A world-class production facility in the heart of bourbon country, with brand building potential and production scale, looked like a bet on a direction the market had been moving for 15 years. Production at Garrard County Distilling Company began in January 2024. In the summer of 2024, Truist Bank went to court. The bank's filing cited the company's failure to meet minimum EBITDA covenants, meaning the distillery was generating less operating income than its loan documents required. It cited failure to pay contractor liens on the property. One construction firm had filed a $2,178,000 lien for unpaid labor and materials. A second lien for approximately $158,000 for additional unpaid work had also been filed. State taxes were unpaid, total debt exceeding $26 million. In April 2025, 15 months after production started, the court appointed a receiver. Workers were furloughed. Production stopped. In June 2026, the entire Garrard County Distilling campus sold at a court-ordered Master Commissioner auction. Sazerac, through a subsidiary called Tom Collins Distilling, won the bid at $20 million, below appraised value, for a campus that had reportedly cost $250 million to build. The failure mode here was not fraud. There is no check for $6,000, no probation sentence, no named individual, whose judgment the court was asked to evaluate. The failure mode was structural, and it was invisible in 2023 when the groundbreaking happened. As of January 1, 2025, there were 16 million barrels of bourbon aging in Kentucky, the highest total ever recorded. Staghorn broke ground on the largest independent distillery in the state 4 months before the market's structural oversupply became impossible to ignore. American whiskey sales fell 1.8% in 2024. Exports fell 19% in 2025 as retaliatory tariffs closed the foreign markets that had been absorbing American production for a decade. Jim Beam, one of the largest bourbon producers in the world, announced a full-year production pause at its primary Claremont, Kentucky facility beginning January 1, 2026. MGP Ingredients, the company whose contract business underlies a significant portion of the craft whiskey ecosystem, reported gross profits down 68% for the full year 2024. Staghorn opened the largest independently owned distillery in Kentucky. Sazerac acquired it for 8 cents on the dollar. The whiskey industry does not punish ambition, it punishes timing. 3 rules that both of those case studies point toward, stated without editorializing. Rule 1. Build distribution before you build capacity. The companies that survived the 2024-2025 contraction had shelf space and existing customer relationships before they had a barrel surplus. A barrel with no committed buyer is not an asset, it is warehouse rent. Rule 2. Never borrow against projected barrel valuations. Barrels are illiquid, physically immovable, and subject to market conditions you cannot control on a 4-year delay. Truist Bank learned this in April 2025 when it discovered that $26 million of collateral was sitting in a rickhouse in Garrard County, Kentucky, with no functioning distribution and no buyers lined up. Rule 3. Run a positive cash flow product during the aging period. Gin, vodka, unaged new make spirit, tasting room revenue, private barrel programs. The distilleries that survived the current contraction had revenue streams that did not require a 4-year lead time. The ones that did not have those streams were entirely dependent on a market that stopped cooperating before the whiskey matured. Rule 4. If you are going to build at production scale, build after the glut. The cycle is real, the cycle is long, and the cycle is currently correcting. The window to break ground is not when every operator in the industry is simultaneously filling rickhouses. It is when those same operators are selling them at auction. The single biggest existential threat to this business model is the one the industry spent 15 years pretending was a solved problem. As of January 1, 2025, 16 million barrels of bourbon are aging in Kentucky. To give that a reference, 16 million barrels contains roughly 848 million gallons of maturing spirit. At current U.S. consumption rates for bourbon, that represents somewhere between 4 and 6 years of supply, sitting in warehouses right now, maturing toward commercial release windows between 2026 and 2032. Between January and August 2025, U.S. bourbon production fell 55 million proof gallons compared to the same period in 2024. That is a 28% year-over-year decline, the lowest 8-month production total since 2018. Jim Beam paused a full year of production. MGP reduced its distilling operations and refocused on its branded spirits segment. Prices for aged whiskey on the bulk market fell 30 to 40% from their 2021 peak. American whiskey exports fell 19% in 2025 following the reimposition of retaliatory tariffs that had originally been negotiated away after 2021. Here is the forward problem. The 16 million barrels currently aging in Kentucky were filled primarily between 2018 and 2023, during the boom. They will all come to market between approximately 2022 and 2027. That means the largest inventory surplus in the modern history of American whiskey is arriving at retail and wholesale simultaneously with a demand plateau and a tariff-driven export contraction. If you are entering this industry today, you are scheduling your production to mature directly into the back end of the longest supply overhang the industry has seen. The mechanism is elegant. The timing is surgical in the wrong direction. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question. How much money do you actually make if you do this right? 2 scenarios. Scenario 1. You open a serious craft whiskey operation in a secondary market with a defensible regional story, somewhere the major producers are not already dominant, where a local provenance narrative adds value. You spend $7 million all in, $2 million in distillation equipment, $1.5 million in facility and build-out, $1 million in licensing, legal and compliance across the TTB permit, state licenses, label registrations, and bonded warehouse qualification, and $2.5 million in working capital to cover 3 years of operating costs before your bourbon reaches commercial maturity. Years 1 through 3, you are selling gin, vodka, and limited releases of unaged new make spirit, tasting room revenue, direct-to-consumer sales, local bar placements. Call it $500,000 per year gross. You are covering approximately your operating overhead, but earning no return on the $7 million invested. Year 4, first bourbon release. Production capacity at a craft scale like this runs approximately 2,000 barrels per year at full output. In year 4, you are not at full output. Call it 1,200 barrels sold at a blended average of $4,000 net revenue per barrel after distributor and retailer margin. That is $4.8 million in year 4 revenue. Operating costs, labor, grain, utilities, debt service, marketing run approximately $3.5 million. Net operating income $1.3 million. Return on the original $7 million, 18% in year 4. Payback period on the full investment, 6 to 8 years from opening day. Not spectacular, not nothing. Scenario 2, you are Sazerac. You have just purchased 210 acres of bourbon infrastructure in Garrard County, Kentucky for $20 million. Infrastructure that costs $250 million to build and contains an existing rickhouse, production equipment, and thousands of barrels of bourbon aging in bonded storage. Your cost basis for every square foot of that facility, every barrel already aging, and every acre of the surrounding land is $20 million total. Your cost of goods sold on the aging inventory you just acquired is a rounding error relative to what it costs to produce. Your payback calculation begins not from the sunk cost of construction, but from the $20 million you actually paid. At institutional production scale, with owned distribution and century-old brand relationships backing your sales team, the return on that acquisition is not measured in years. It is measured in quarters. The difference between Scenario 1 and Scenario 2 is not skill. It is not vision. Both builders, the craft operator in the secondary market and Staghorn in Garrard County, had vision. The difference is where you entered the cycle. The person who built Garrard County had the right infrastructure in the wrong market moment. The person who bought it at auction had none of the vision and all of the return. So, do you still want to own a whiskey distillery empire? The answer you arrived here with was yes. The answer you probably have now is yes, but not the one I'd build. The one I'd buy after the person who built it ran out of patience. The best bourbon ages for 12 years. So does the best deal in this business. If you found this useful, subscribe. We run these numbers every week.